Have you ever wondered why every great society, no matter how powerful or prosperous, eventually collapses under the weight of its own financial illusions? What if I told you that behind every economic boom, every sudden crisis, every political upheaval, there is a hidden pattern quietly repeating itself across centuries? A pattern built not on accidents, but on deliberate manipulation, engineered incentives, and a level of monetary control so subtle that most people never even notice it happening. As we speak, humanity is standing in the middle of this recurring script, the six-stage grand fraud cycle, and whether we like it or not, we are already deep inside stage 4. This is not about conspiracy theories or dramatic exaggerations. It is about the documented rhythm of economic empires, financial elites, monetary engineering, and the predictable human behaviors that fuel them. Throughout history, the same blueprint has appeared again and again. Concentrated wealth, expanding power, widening inequality, currency manipulation, institutional decay, and eventually, a breaking point that no government can contain. The uncomfortable truth is that we are not living through a unique moment. We are reliving an ancient pattern dressed in modern clothes. And the most dangerous part of this cycle is not the collapse itself. It is the illusion of stability that comes right before it. A period where people genuinely believe the system is working, where financial markets seem healthy, where institutions appear trustworthy, where the average citizen feels safe enough to ignore the cracks forming beneath their feet. That illusion is today's reality, and that is why understanding this pattern is not optional. It is survival. What you are about to uncover may challenge everything you thought you knew about economics, power, and the world we live in. It may force you to question whether the system protects you or uses you. It may even make you look at history with new eyes, realizing that the same forces operating centuries ago are still shaping your financial life right now. You might find echoes of Spain, Britain, Rome, or modern superpowers hidden in plain sight behind today's headlines. You might even recognize the same psychological traps that kept entire civilizations blind until it was too late. Before we move forward, tell me something. Have you ever felt that the economic game is rigged? That no matter how hard people work, the system always seems to tilt in favor of a select few? Have you ever sensed that major financial crises don't just happen? They are engineered, exploited, and transformed into opportunities for those who understand the cycle? Your perspective matters here, and your experience might reveal more than you think. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you have ever felt caught inside this system. And do not forget to like this video and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. What comes next may surprise you, and it connects directly to the next part of this unfolding cycle, where the real architecture of this grand historical pattern begins to reveal itself. When you start tracing the roots of every major financial collapse, every era of sudden prosperity followed by ruin, you begin to notice something unsettling. None of these cycles begin with chaos. They begin with order. They begin with systems that appear stable, rational, even fair. And it is precisely this sense of stability that allows the seeds of the grand fraud cycle to take root. At the heart of every empire, every major economic power, there is always a moment when a small group discovers how to bend the rules, quietly, strategically, and always under the guise of maintaining progress. This is the foundational stage of the fraud cycle, where wealth is not yet stolen openly, but positioned. Where power is not seized violently, but accumulated through influence, access, and the ability to rewrite financial reality without anyone noticing. It begins with subtle changes in monetary policy, small adjustments in taxation, new mechanisms of credit creation, and financial instruments that very few people understand. And the fewer people who understand, the easier it becomes to shape the system in ways that benefit the architects of the cycle. What makes this stage so dangerous is that it feels harmless, even beneficial. Economic growth appears steady. Institutions present themselves as guardians of stability. Politicians promise efficiency. Banks promise innovation. Central authorities promote new monetary models as solutions to old problems. But beneath these promises lies a structural shift. The the concentration of economic power into the hands of those who control the flow of currency. Every historical cycle starts exactly here, with small decisions that slowly detach money from real value and place it under the authority of those who define what money even is. History is full of examples. Empires that once maintained strict monetary discipline found ways to expand their money supply quietly. Banking elites developed new channels to influence governments through credit. Wealthy families learned to finance state ambitions in exchange for privileges the population never saw. These movements were rarely dramatic. They were procedural, administrative, technical. But they carried consequences that would only be felt generations later. The structure of the system was being redesigned, not for the many, but for the few. And while people continued to work, save, and trust the institutions guiding their future, the blueprint of the fraud cycle advanced step by step. It is this early phase that creates the framework for everything that comes next. A framework built on the illusion of fairness, the promise of opportunity, and the belief that the system is designed to serve society rather than control it. But once this foundation is laid, once the mechanisms of monetary manipulation are in place, the cycle does not slow down. It accelerates. And the next stage pushes humanity even deeper into a pattern that has repeated for centuries. As the early architecture of the fraud cycle solidifies, the next movement unfolds almost invisibly: the silent accumulation of wealth and control. This is the stage where the system begins to curve away from the interests of the majority and toward the ambitions of an increasingly concentrated elite. And the brilliance of this phase lies in how subtle it is. Nothing appears dramatic from the outside. Markets rise, credit expands, institutions seem functional, and people feel optimistic about their financial future. Yet beneath that optimism, the power dynamics of the entire society are being rewritten. This stage operates through mechanics that most citizens never question. Access to credit becomes stratified, with the wealthiest gaining not only the cheapest money, but the first access to opportunities created by that money. New financial products emerge, not designed to help the public, but to generate leverage for those who already hold capital. Entire industries begin to reorient themselves around speculation rather than production. What once fueled economic growth, labor, innovation, and productivity, is gradually replaced by financial engineering, insider networks, and privileged information streams that circulate only among the well-positioned. It is in this environment that wealth accumulation transforms into a form of power consolidation. When a few entities can influence the cost of money, shape market behavior, or dictate policy outcomes through lobbying and strategic partnerships, they no longer compete within the system. They shape it. They learn how to turn inflation into a tool, debt into an asset, and public crises into private advantages. While ordinary people experience rising costs, shrinking purchasing power, and unstable wages, the elite financial class grows stronger precisely because the system amplifies their advantages at each turn. But perhaps the most dangerous part of this stage is psychological. The population still believes the system is operating fairly. They see success stories, rising asset prices, expanding industries, and assume these signals reflect broad prosperity. They do not realize that the gains are increasingly captured by a narrow segment at the top, leaving the rest with only the illusion of progress. People continue to trust the institutions guiding them, unaware that those institutions have already shifted their loyalty toward the concentrated wealth that sustains their influence. And as this silent concentration intensifies, the gap between perception and reality widens. Those who benefit grow increasingly insulated from the consequences of their decisions, while those who depend on the system grow more vulnerable to its hidden risks. It is here, in this widening divide, that the next phase of the fraud cycle begins to take shape. Once wealth and influence have quietly consolidated at the top, the cycle advances into a phase far more calculated and far more destructive: the deliberate manipulation of money itself. This is the moment in the fraud cycle when currency stops being a neutral medium of exchange and becomes a strategic weapon. A tool engineered to shift value, reassign power, and create dependencies that most citizens never notice until the damage is irreversible. And the most unsettling part is that this shift never arrives with dramatic announcements. It unfolds slowly, presented as modernization, innovation, or necessary adjustments to match the demands of a changing world. This stage emerges when those in control understand a fundamental truth. If you can shape the value of money, you can shape the behavior of an entire society. And so, manipulation begins with policies that appear harmless. Small changes in interest rates, new lending programs, expanded credit facilities. Soon, those changes evolve into more powerful mechanisms: currency debasement, artificial liquidity injections, and monetary expansion that creates a widening gap between financial markets and real economic life. Money is no longer tied to production, effort, or tangible value. It becomes an abstract instrument that can be stretched, distorted, and redefined at will. Historical patterns show this transformation again and again. Empires that once relied on hard reserves began diluting their currency to meet political ambitions. Banking families leveraged their influence to redefine what counted as collateral. Central institutions learned how to create money without limits, directing its flow toward the entities most aligned with their interests. And while these shifts were always justified as pragmatic or necessary, they consistently produced the same outcome. The wealthy grew wealthier through asset inflation, while the working population faced rising costs, stagnant wages, and shrinking purchasing power. The brilliance of this manipulation lies in how invisible it feels to the average person. Prices climb slowly. Savings lose value quietly. The cost of living increases year by year, but no single moment feels like an attack. Instead, people blame their jobs, their circumstances, or the broader economy, unaware that monetary design, not personal failure, is reshaping their financial reality. Meanwhile, those who control the flow of currency are positioned above the turbulence, watching their assets appreciate while the rest of society struggles to keep pace. And once money itself becomes a mechanism of control rather than a neutral tool, the psychological consequences deepen. People begin to distrust their own progress, sensing instability but unable to identify its source. They work harder, save more desperately, and stretch further just to maintain the same standard of living. All while the architects of the system benefit from the very pressures they create. It is in this tension, this widening emotional and financial strain, that the next transformation of the fraud cycle gains momentum. Before we move on, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt that money seems to lose value faster than your efforts can keep up? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can see how this stage of the cycle is affecting people in real time. As monetary manipulation becomes embedded in the system, something fascinating and dangerous begins to happen. Instead of triggering alarm, the distortions create the appearance of stability. Markets climb, credit expands, consumption rises, and governments proudly announce that the economy is strong, resilient, or healthy. Yet this stability is not a sign of genuine strength. It is the calm engineered by a financial architecture designed to delay consequences rather than solve problems. What people interpret as prosperity is, in reality, a temporary cushion built on debt, speculation, and artificially inflated confidence. This is the most deceptive phase of the fraud cycle, because it convinces society that everything is working. Asset prices rise across the board. Housing markets soar. Stock portfolios grow. Businesses report record profits. Even as real productivity stagnates, speculation fills the gap, creating a sense of forward momentum that keeps the population optimistic. And optimism is precisely what the system needs, because no engineered economy can survive without people believing in its promises. The illusion works only as long as people remain confident. But beneath the surface, the real economy begins to show subtle fractures. Wages fail to keep up with rising prices. Debt becomes a necessity for maintaining even basic living standards. Households stretch themselves thin, borrowing not for luxury, but for survival. The same institutions that appear stable are actually becoming more fragile, dependent on continuous intervention to keep markets afloat. Central authorities cushion declines with liquidity. Banks leverage themselves to uncomfortable extremes, and governments spend far beyond their means to maintain the image of prosperity. This illusion also reshapes social behavior. People begin to measure success not by what they earn, but by what they can borrow. Consumption is celebrated. Frugality becomes outdated. Savings lose relevance because money itself loses reliability. Generations grow accustomed to the idea that markets only move upward, that crises are brief anomalies, and that authorities can always fix whatever goes wrong. This collective belief forms the psychological backbone of the fraud cycle, blinding society to the growing instability beneath its feet. Meanwhile, those orchestrating the system understand exactly what is happening. They know that debt-driven growth is unsustainable, that asset inflation widens inequality, and that the longer the illusion lasts, the more catastrophic the eventual correction will be. Yet they also know that exposing these truths would collapse confidence, so transparency becomes the enemy. Reports are softened, metrics are adjusted, narratives are crafted to assure the public that any weakness is temporary, manageable, or already under control. As this stage deepens, the gap between perception and reality grows dangerously wide. People feel that something is off, yet the signals around them encourage complacency. It is in this fragile equilibrium, where everything appears stable while the foundation quietly erodes, that the next phase of the fraud cycle begins to take shape. As the illusion of stability stretches itself to its limits, faint but unmistakable signals begin to surface. Signals that only a few notice at first. Yet they carry the same warnings that echoed before every major financial unraveling in history. These are not dramatic crashes or sudden systemic failures. They are subtle tremors, emerging quietly in the background, revealing that the foundations supporting the apparent prosperity are weakening. And because these signs rarely announce themselves with urgency, most societies ignore them until the pattern becomes undeniable. It begins with discrepancies. Economic data that no longer aligns with lived reality. Reports of record growth while small businesses close in alarming numbers. Financial institutions posting massive profits in sectors disconnected from actual production. Families working harder, yet falling further behind. These contradictions accumulate until they become impossible to dismiss. The gap between official narratives and everyday experience widens, creating a silent tension that spreads through the population. At the structural level, early stress fractures emerge in the most sensitive parts of the economy. Debt levels accelerate far faster than income. Governments rely increasingly on short-term financing to cover long-term obligations. Banking systems become leveraged to the point where a minor shock could trigger cascading failures. Markets respond to bad news with surprising fragility, revealing how dependent they have become on artificial support rather than organic fundamentals. Each of these signals is a small crack, but together they form a map pointing directly toward systemic vulnerability. Social dynamics begin shifting as well. The upper tiers of society, often the first to detect instability, discreetly reposition their assets. Capital migrates into safer jurisdictions. Corporations begin consolidating, preparing for leaner conditions. Insider networks adjust their portfolios, anticipating corrections long before public warnings appear. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens sense something changing but cannot articulate it. They feel pressure without understanding its origin, anxiety without visible cause, frustration without a clear target. In the broader environment, geopolitical tensions escalate. Nations competing for resources or influence begin showing signs of stress. Trade disputes intensify, alliances weaken, and political rhetoric becomes more erratic. These global frictions are not random. They are symptoms of internal economic strain manifesting outward. History shows that when financial foundations weaken, nations turn their eyes outward, seeking distraction, leverage, or blame. These tensions amplify uncertainty, adding yet another layer of instability to an already fragile system. And all the while, institutions insist that everything is under control. That inflation is temporary, that markets are healthy, that risks are contained. But the calmness of official reassurance often masks urgency beneath the surface. Because once these early signals appear, once contradictions, financial strain, social shifts, and geopolitical friction converge, the fraud cycle has already entered a phase from which it rarely reverses. The next transformation begins when the public's trust starts to crack in response to pressures that can no longer be ignored. By the time a society enters stage 4 of the grand fraud cycle, the shift is no longer subtle. The early tremors that once felt distant begin to land directly in people's daily lives. What was once quiet discomfort becomes open skepticism. What was once a vague sense that something is wrong becomes a widespread loss of faith in the very institutions meant to preserve stability. And once trust begins to fracture at this scale, a profound transformation takes place, one that history shows is nearly impossible to reverse. This stage does not begin with a shocking collapse. It begins with contradictions that can no longer be explained away. Governments assure the public that inflation is controlled, yet groceries cost more each month. Officials claim the economy is strong, yet families feel poorer despite working harder. Banks promote financial security, yet people witness scandals, bailouts, and failures that reveal how fragile the system really is. Confidence erodes not because of a single event, but because the narrative no longer matches reality. In this climate, institutional credibility dissolves piece by piece. Trust in political leadership collapses as promises repeatedly fail to materialize. Trust in central banks fades as monetary decisions seem disconnected from real-world consequences. Trust in the media disintegrates as information becomes polarized, sensationalized, or blatantly contradictory. The public begins to suspect that the truth is being obscured, manipulated, or withheld entirely. And suspicion quickly evolves into disillusionment. At the social level, this breakdown becomes visible through rising tension and fragmentation. Communities split along ideological, economic, and cultural lines. Groups that once cooperated begin to see each other as adversaries. Conversations become confrontational. Institutions that once acted as stabilizing forces, schools, courts, public agencies, become battlegrounds where competing narratives collide. The idea of a shared national identity dissolves, replaced by isolated factions, each believing they are the only ones seeing reality clearly. Meanwhile, those who benefit from the system's structure sense the shift and attempt to manage the narrative. They emphasize stability, project confidence, and insist that any distrust is misplaced or irrational. But their reassurances no longer land. When people feel economic pressure, when they see corruption exposed, when they witness growing inequality, no slogan or speech can restore belief. Trust is not rebuilt through messaging, it is rebuilt through transparency and accountability, neither of which thrives in a system designed to obscure its own mechanisms. As this distrust spreads, a powerful psychological transformation takes place. People begin to detach emotionally from the system. They disengage from political participation. They question traditional authorities. They look for alternative explanations, new voices, or counter-narratives to make sense of the chaos. This search for meaning, often turbulent, sometimes desperate, is a defining feature of Stage 4. It signals that society is no longer anchored, that the collective mind has begun drifting toward unpredictable directions, and that the cycle is accelerating toward its next evolution. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Have you personally felt this loss of trust in the institutions meant to guide and protect society? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can understand how deeply Stage 4 is unfolding in people's real lives. As public trust unravels and society enters the turbulence of Stage 4, the elites who helped construct and benefit from the system begin to respond, not with reform, but with preservation. Their objective is not to restore stability for the population, but to maintain control over a system that has started slipping from their grasp. And throughout history, their reactions follow the same predictable pattern: consolidation, distraction, and reinforcement of the very mechanisms that fueled the cycle in the first place. The first reaction is consolidation. Financial institutions merge into fewer, larger entities with increased control over credit flows. Corporations acquire competitors, gaining dominance over industries essential to everyday life. Political alliances tighten as those in power form protective blocks, crafting policies that safeguard their interests. Laws are adjusted subtly. sometimes quietly, sometimes aggressively, to reduce accountability and expand authority. These shifts are framed as necessary for stability, but in practice, they concentrate decision-making at the top. Next comes distraction, a tactic as old as power itself. As economic tensions rise, attention is redirected toward ideological battles, social conflict, or external threats. Public discourse becomes saturated with polarizing issues that divide citizens into camps. This fragmentation is not accidental. A divided population is less able to organize, less able to question systemic failures, and less likely to recognize the deeper economic forces shaping their frustrations. While the public argues over cultural or political differences, the underlying power structures tighten their grip. Then comes reinforcement. Elites begin leveraging tools that were once subtle, but now become overt. Surveillance, regulatory pressure, information control, and narratives designed to redefine the crisis as something beyond their responsibility. Monetary authorities deploy increasingly aggressive interventions, artificial liquidity injections, emergency lending, and market rescues that disproportionately benefit the highest levels of the financial hierarchy. Governments justify extraordinary measures as temporary solutions, even though history shows such measures rarely remain temporary. The psychological effect of this stage is profound. People sense that the rules are shifting, that the system is no longer even pretending to operate for their benefit. They see executives rewarded while workers struggle, political leaders insulated from the consequences of their decisions, and institutions acting not as stabilizers, but as shields for those at the top. Every attempt by elites to maintain control amplifies public resentment, feeding the momentum of the cycle. Internationally, the crisis deepens as nations replicate the same defensive posture. Alliances become strained. Trade tensions intensify. Each country seeks to protect its own economic position, often at the expense of others. These moves accelerate instability, creating ripple effects across markets and societies. The world enters a period where every decision, domestic or global, is influenced by fear of losing control. And while the elites tighten their hold, the system they are trying to preserve becomes even more fragile. The contradictions that fueled Stage 4 now intensify, pushing society toward a threshold where pressure can no longer be contained. It is in this tightening spiral, where power consolidates as stability erodes, that the next phase of the fraud cycle begins to emerge. As the crisis deepens and the elites fortify their control, the system enters a precarious phase, preparation for the final stages of the fraud cycle. Although the general population is only beginning to sense instability, insiders and influential actors already recognize the trajectory. They see Stage 5, the escalation of societal unrest and collective action, and Stage 6, the ultimate collapse, looming on the horizon. This preparation is not defensive altruism. It is strategic positioning to secure advantage and ensure survival as the system unravels around them. The first sign of preparation is reallocation of resources. Wealth, influence, and essential assets are quietly moved into more secure hands, often offshore or behind layers of corporate and financial insulation. This reallocation is not always visible to the public, but it has far-reaching implications. Liquidity is preserved for those who anticipate the crisis, while ordinary participants remain exposed to the unfolding instability. The financial elite effectively insulates themselves from systemic shocks, ensuring that when correction comes, they retain the power to dictate terms. Next comes policy manipulation. Governments and central institutions introduce measures that appear stabilizing. Regulatory adjustments, emergency interventions, and stimulus programs, but which in reality are calibrated to protect assets and consolidate power, rather than restore genuine balance. Monetary tools are wielded to prop up markets, maintain liquidity, and prevent sudden collapses. The illusion of order is extended, buying time for the elite to solidify their positions and prepare for the volatility that inevitably follows Stage 4. Simultaneously, psychological operations are deployed. Public perception is carefully managed through narratives that emphasize resilience, progress, and institutional competence. Media, education systems, and influential voices reinforce the idea that instability is temporary, minor, or misrepresented. Yet, beneath this narrative, the structural weaknesses of the system continue to expand. Ordinary citizens may sense unease, but without clarity or context, their ability to respond effectively is constrained. Fear and confusion become tools as much as assets. Globally, these preparations amplify systemic interdependencies. International trade networks, financial flows, and alliances are leveraged to stabilize critical sectors, while allowing vulnerabilities elsewhere to grow unnoticed. Nations participate in complex, reciprocal arrangements that appear cooperative, but in reality, they embed dependencies that will exacerbate the impact of the next phase. The more interconnected the system becomes, the more catastrophic the eventual correction will be. And as these measures accumulate, the stage is set for an almost inevitable tipping point. Stage 5 will test the resilience of social structures, and Stage 6 will expose the true fragility of institutions long believed to be unshakable. The cycle accelerates, and the patterns that have repeated for centuries once again converge, signaling that the most consequential phase of this historical blueprint is approaching. As we approach the culmination of this historical pattern, it becomes clear that the grand fraud cycle is not theoretical. It is alive, evolving, and unfolding before our eyes. Humanity stands at a crossroads where wealth concentration, monetary manipulation, institutional distrust, and systemic fragility intersect. All the stages we've explored, from the quiet accumulation of influence to the deliberate shaping of currency, the illusion of stability, the early tremors of collapse, and the erosion of public trust, have built toward this moment. Stage 5 looms: widespread societal recognition, unrest, and the acceleration of systemic pressures. Stage 6, the tipping point, awaits as a consequence of decisions made decades, even centuries ago. It is tempting to feel powerless, to believe that the currents of history are beyond individual influence. Yet awareness is the first step toward understanding, and understanding opens the door to preparation. Recognizing the patterns allows us to interpret the signals of our time, to see beyond the comforting narratives of institutions, markets, and authorities. It allows us to question, analyze, and anticipate, rather than react blindly when the next shock arrives. History shows that societies caught unprepared pay the highest price. Those who study the cycles gain clarity and resilience. Reflecting on the arc of this cycle, the recurring motifs of concentration, manipulation, and eventual collapse reveal that the system is not accidental. It was deliberately engineered, refined across generations, and perpetuated through mechanisms that few understand. Awareness is not just intellectual, it is strategic. Observing how the stages repeat, how trust is built and broken, and how economic and social levers are manipulated, equips individuals to navigate turbulence more effectively. Ignorance is costly. Insight is empowering. Now, if this analysis has opened your eyes, if you see how the threads of history are mirrored in our present, take a moment to act. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What struck you most about this cycle? How have you seen aspects of it reflected in your own experience or community? Hit the like button if this exploration has reshaped your understanding of wealth, power, and systemic manipulation. And if you want to continue uncovering these patterns, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, because there is more to discover, and the next video will build directly on the insights you've gained here. There is no exaggeration when history repeats itself. The sequence of human ambition, financial engineering, and institutional failure is locked in. Understanding it is the key to navigating the unfolding reality, and staying informed is the only way to remain ahead of the currents that have toppled civilizations before. With this perspective, you are not just a spectator. You are aware, alert, and prepared to witness what comes next with clarity and insight. And from this awareness, we continue the journey into the deeper mechanics of the grand fraud cycle.